Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Hi, welcome back to Neuroverse. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about making habit and how learning from reward may not be the only way it happens. To help us with this topic, we are joined by Dr. Francesca Greenstreet, who has completed her PhD in Marcus Stevenson Jones' lab in SWC on dopaminergic action prediction errors and how they serve as a value-free teaching signal. Francesca is now doing her postdoc with Claudia Klopath and Juan Gallego on computational models, specifically looking at how the brain does reinforcement learning when there's a large action space, so many actions possible. Welcome to the podcast, Francesca.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Just to get us started, what got you into systems neuroscience?
Yeah, I actually came from a really broad background. I started my undergraduate degree in biomedical sciences, so I actually was studying things like hearts and cells and did biochemistry modules. But then actually it was neuroscience that really appealed to me. I was doing my undergrad at UCL and they have this super good neuroscience program and sort of kept leaning more and more that way. Then did some lab experience and that was in a systems neuroscience lab, and it was just really cool, like going all the way from behavior, like, basically like cells to behavior level. Yeah. It was super cool, and obviously I was like blown away by it and wanted to do more of that and decided to do a PhD in that, so yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I had a similar journey because I did biochemistry for my undergrad and then slowly
oh, wow,
made
that's
my
cool.
way to neuroscience.
You also climbed up the hierarchy in terms of like order of magnitude
exactly.
of understanding.
Yeah. Wow, I can actually see my samples now. And let's dive right into your Nature paper about dopaminergic action prediction errors. And could you initially start by explaining the behavioral paradigm that you set up and that you were researching?
Yeah, so actually this behavioral paradigm was one that had been previously established in the Zeta lab. And actually we were interested in it because we really wanted to understand stimulus action learning in the brain. So when you hear a sound and have to make a choice, which is sort of the sort of thing you actually in your real life do all the time. Like I can think of an example with visual stuff where you see a traffic light go red, you have to stop. Mm-hmm. This is like the sort of thing we wanted to understand. We chose like an auditory task because mice are really good at hearing, hopefully. And this task had been established. And so in this task, mice basically, it's self-paced. So they are like free to do whatever they want basically, but they want to get the reward. So they have to put their head into they have 3 ports basically. Then they have to put their head into a central port to initiate the trial, and in the central port, when their head's there, they'll hear like a sound, and this sound is a mixture of like high and low frequencies. Mm-hmm. And depending on if it's more high frequencies or more low frequencies, they'll have to make a left or a right choice. And to do this, they put their head in one of the left ports or the right port to indicate their choice. And if they're correct, based on how we decide the task is set up, they will get a reward.
Okay, cool. Are there any value-based decisions that they need to make in this task?
Yeah, so actually the whole task in many ways is value-based, and actually that's why we got interested in this task is it seems like really value-based, and the part of the brain people had previously established where the plasticity, so where this connection, this association is formed, is known to really be involved in value-based decision-making. Like the basal ganglia is famously involved in reinforcement learning, so learning from reward with dopamine. And so this plasticity, so this connection is sort of strengthened at this cortico-basal ganglia synapse. And so it's known that this is thought to be made in a value-based way. So it was really strange when actually there was another group that recorded from the dopamine neurons, which are meant to carry the reward signal, and these dopamine neurons didn't have any reward information. And so this obviously got us really interested in how we can be learning this association in this part of the brain, but there's no reward signal going to this part of the brain, because this is the classic picture of how you learn from reward, mm-hmm. how you learn to make value-based decisions. Head goes to the side means, you're going to get reward if the sound was high, mm-hmm. Is meant to be happening through getting the sound signal in from the cortex, getting the reward signal in from the dopamine neurons, and then that strengthening the connection. But it couldn't be the case in this setup.
Cool. So it was an association, like contextual information task, where the mice would hear like a high pitch or low pitch tone, and then based on like trial history and learning to associate like the high pitched tone with a specific direction, they would take that action.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and they always had the same sound, like high frequency turn left or high frequency turn right pairing throughout the paradigm.
Cool. So how was it like decoupling the reward from the movement? Because in the basal ganglia, like there's like you can see movement signals everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So how did you go about decoupling those two signals?
So we're lucky that reward and movement in this task are thankfully like quite separated in time, but we did quite a lot of things to try and make this even more so. So we put the ports a bit more spaced out so that the movements would last longer, so that the movement from the center to the side would last longer. And then it's only after they finish making the movement do they get the reward. So in time, they're nicely decoupled here. We had a bit more problems decoupling anything that might be to do with the sound from the movement, but this is where having two choices, left and right, really helped us out. Because if you have a signal that's to do with the sound, you should see it regardless of if they make a left or right choice. Where if you have something to do with the movement, the brain's known to control contralateral, so that means like on the opposite side of the brain, movement. So if you record from one side of the brain, you should see signals to do with movement on the other side of the brain. And this is actually what we saw. So in the dopamine signal, we saw a signal that only happened when the animals made a contralateral choice, so that when they moved to the opposite side of the brain to what I was recording from.
Interesting. Did you do perturbations and see if you can either, I guess, inhibit whether the mice did the contralateral choice or try and make it subversive in any way, or how it affected their performance and things like that?
Yeah, so my colleague Anando did some perturbations, and it's actually a really cool effect, and we'll probably talk a bit about the model, how this fits with the model in a bit, but the cool effect is that you don't bias the animal's choice in the given trial, but what you do is you slowly drive a bias over the whole session. If you constantly pair this like contralateral movement with dopamine stimulation, you can slowly bias the animal's choice towards that side over the whole session, which is kind of cool.
Just rewinding a little bit. So you said that like it was unexpected that the dopamine signals in this area are not related to the value-based learning, but how exactly was that? Like, did you show that?
Yeah.
And following up from that, what was your like hypothesis, or what was your purpose in using this task, and what was the main questions that you're trying to address?
Yeah. So it was, the previous literature had shown there's not value-based signals. If you give rewards, unexpected rewards, there's no response in dopamine neurons, which is surprising for this part of the striatum. Well, it's surprising for striatum in general. We're in a specific part of the striatum, the one that gets a lot of auditory input. That's why we're there. It's also the part that the task is known to form this synaptic strengthening in. So we also tested whether or not there was information about reward in the dopamine signal there. So we gave unexpected rewards, we gave omissions of rewards in the task, and all of this in the sort of classic reward prediction error hypothesis framework, which is the sort of framework that's thought to be the thing driving learning in the basal ganglia. So unexpected rewards should give you a positive signal, omitted rewards should give you a negative signal. And actually there's also this phenomenon where over learning, the signal should move from the reward to the cue, which has been captured by classic reinforcement learning models of how dopamine aids learning. And so the signal at reward should go down and the signal at the cue should grow. So we had this sort of classic hypothesis with like really testable to examine, but we also knew there was no reward information in these neurons. So what's going on? We find this movement signal. And actually there had been recently, we were really lucky actually that like around the time I was doing these recording experiments, there had been some computational papers coming out suggesting there might be another way that dopamine, well actually initially it wasn't dopamine, but then there was a later paper that suggested it might be dopamine, but that you could be reinforcing a stimulus action association, so sound go left, sound go right association, but not using anything to do with the reward, and actually going back to like classic psychology theories, like Edward Thorndike. He basically had these two ideas of like the law of exercise and the law of effect. And one of these is like, oh, if you do something more over and over again, you just do it because you've done it before. And the other ones, you do it because it's valuable. And you do it because it's valuable has been sort of the idea that's really dominated like classic like learning theories in neuroscience for a long time. And actually sort of doing it because you've done it many times before has slightly fallen out of out of being studied. And so actually we sort of thought, but these computational papers sort of formalized this idea of like repeating something because you've done it many times before. And actually a movement signal in many ways is actually makes a lot of sense, that this would help you repeat something you've done before because it's going to be specific to the movement. It's going to help drive that home. And so basically the idea is that if you do something really unexpected, you're going to get this big signal at the time of the movement as like a surprise in the action that you did. And as you learn to predict, the whole point of the system would be that you're learning to predict which action you've taken from which action you take in that situation in the past. So if always when I've heard high tones, I take a go left, then I'll keep reinforcing this basically. But it's not to do with the reward, because you're just doing it because you've always done it before.
That makes a lot of sense. So this was all done in mice that had already learned, but would it be different if you did it during the learning process?
So I actually recorded from like the beginning of learning. So these were long experiments, months. So actually, so what's interesting is I think what you're getting at is that something needs to make the mice be biased to one side for you to, you just need a subtle bias for this system to basically hammer it home and be like, okay, we seem to be going left when we hear a high sound and we're just going to drive that, keep doing that. But something needs to create that slight imbalance to create a bias, right? So this was kind of crucial because it means that the system can't work in isolation. It needs another system at the same time, which needs to be learning using reward, at least initially, to create a slight bias in your behavior towards the rewarded side. And so it was clear also because we did, like my colleague Fernando did some lesion studies where he basically lesioned the dopaminergic input. He also lesioned the cells in the part of striatum. They also did experiments with a sort of synaptic plasticity blocker, and these all had a very similar characteristic effect, was you could still learn, but it was way slower and you never quite got to the same performance level, which would actually really fit if you think about that there's another system that's really helping you learn the association initially, but this is the system that really makes you like get it right on 100% of trials, and you just keep doing the same thing over and over again. And it's also really well known that it's really hard to reverse the contingency. So if you switch to left and right sides, this has been previously reported in this task, it actually takes basically as learn to relearn as it took to learn in the first place. So this would also make sense that like if this system's really just making you form in many ways a strong habit, and it's not the thing that sets up the initial bias, all of these lesion sort of effects really get captured in the fact that it's super hard to switch your behavior as well, because it's just like really, really securely stored in this new system, which is this sort of like value-free system.
That's so super interesting, and it kind of makes me think like how many of our actions are repetitive that we don't realize, because we really are like doing the same things again and again on a daily basis. So.
I think it's, exactly. I think it's really relatable to a lot of human stuff. I think it's also gets on the question of why would you even have this kind of learning system? Because it seems a bit bad. I don't know if that like was what comes out to you, but it doesn't seem like a great idea to just keep doing what you've done before. But we do a lot of, firstly, like we know a lot of human behavior. We do just keep doing things we've done before. I don't know, on my way here, like I definitely like walked from the tube station and took exactly the turning I've always taken round in this neighborhood, because I kind of know the way around there, and it just, I don't know, I didn't think about it very much. And that's, in many ways, I think we think the system is to do things that you don't want to think about very much. It's like an automation. There's also been some theoretical work with more computational models where people suggest that this type of learning is maybe like a default. So there's, in reinforcement learning, this idea of a default policy. And like, if you don't know what policy is, what it basically is a fancy way of saying like what you're going to do in a certain situation. That's what a policy is. And so this is like, actually, you know, maybe I'm not sure what to do because I've never experienced this before, but let's just try this because this is what's worked for other things in the past, and this might be a really good way of like saving your default policy in a really like easy way.
I wonder what the evolutionary advantage is, if it's just like an energy efficient thing to do, and it also like probes a little bit at like I guess like exploration versus not exploring, where like that curiosity about trying to do something different. And there's also that thing about if you do the same thing every day, your perspective on time is shorter, whereas if you do something like new or different every day, your perspective on time is longer because it requires more energy and requires more to pay more attention. You don't quite like have that thing where, you know, you're walking the same route to work and it's like, oh, I'm here already. You know, you've blanked out the last 30 minutes.
That's really cool. I think there's something there, and I think like from the energy point of view, like there's not been any experimental work done on like is this more energetically efficient, but there's been some computational work done on that, and they used information theory to basically say like if we want to save like this policy, so like this plan of what to do in a given situation, and if we want to do it for something you've always done over and over again, and I guess sorry, I'm switching between things, but the analogy here is you know, in like language, there are words that come up all the time, and we actually often use really short words for those words that come up all the time. And this is actually a really good way of saving energy in a way, of, you know, using the shorter words to describe words that come up all the time, whereas super complicated things like information theory are actually really long words. And actually we can do something a bit like this in the brain, that if this is the sort of thing we've done all the time, we've done it over and over again, maybe there's a way of saving that in a smaller form, and this might be a way of learning how to save the things that come up all the time. And this is how you know this is the behavior I do all the time, so save that in a really energetically efficient way. So there's like this idea that maybe this system could be helping you learn which behaviors you do all the time, so how to save energy.
Yeah.
Could you help paint a bit of a picture of the circuit in the bigger context of the brain? Like what are the inputs that are driving this movement related activity, and what are the outputs?
No, I think it's actually a complicated circuit. So it's part of the cortico-basal ganglia loop, and this basically involves cortex, many parts of cortex. So here I said it gets auditory input, and what I meant is auditory cortex. So we're in the part of the striatum. Striatum's huge. It's like a big bit of your brain, and it gets the whole thing gets a lot of input from cortex and many of the different parts of cortex. So motor cortex, somatosensory cortex, here auditory cortex, and then the striatum is the sort of input part of the basal ganglia. This receives all of that input from cortex, and then it goes via a few substriatal nuclei, and these same neurons eventually via a few steps go to the dopamine neurons, which then feed back to striatum with the signal that's known to sort of like strengthen synapses. And simultaneously, the basal ganglia, so again striatum and a couple of other things down the line, eventually output to things like brainstem, but it also goes back up to things like motor cortex. So there's also like a lot of debate whether or not like this output is truly going straight via brainstem, or do we always output via motor cortex, and this is also something that people are researching. But basically I think you can think of it as it gets a lot of input from cortex, which maybe has a sort of high level representations, or even low level, maybe it just represents the tones, and then it does some sort of learning processes based with dopamine in some way, whether it's value-based or value-free, and then it can drive your motor behavior through either things like brainstem or going back through motor cortex.
Yeah, that is a complicated circuit.
Yeah, and the fact is all these loops because the dopamine gets input from the striatum and then goes back to the striatum, so that's a super complicated thing. Yeah,
and does this dopamine signal in general, does it tend to be quite local? Does it tend to be, does the main effect of it tend to be like, you know, synaptic plasticity in the vicinity of the dopamine? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And this is, again, a big thing that's been debated by the field. And there's been quite a lot of work where people show that one dopamine neuron actually has quite a broad, like they call it arborization, you know, because of the neurons look like trees, and they kind of, you imagine a tree with many branches going over a big area. So actually one dopamine neuron can innervate quite a lot of the striatum. And what's interesting is that dopamine neurons that go to the bit of the striatum, the tail of the striatum where I was recording, are a bit different, and they receive a different set of inputs from different regions and different bits of the striatum, indirectly, obviously. So they seem to form a sort of distinct subclass. Okay. But movement signals in dopamine neurons have also been recorded in other bits of the striatum. So this is also interesting about whether or not these also might be carrying what we call this action prediction error, so this movement-based signal that reinforces doing over and over the same thing.
And it could be maybe in like non-auditory tasks that are mainly encoded in other parts of the striatum?
Exactly, yeah. So the reason why we were recording in this bit of the striatum was twofold. Obviously, this auditory task, which was super nicely set up, and people had found the site of synaptic plasticity, super useful if you want to have like a nice behavioral paradigm, knowing exactly where in the brain that plasticity is happening, great. But it was also because the signals had not got any rewards. This clearly set up a clear question for us. But actually, other bits of the striatum, as you said, yes, they get other inputs, maybe more cognitive tasks. Who knows? Can you have habits that are cognitive? Would be kind of cool to see. But they do get movement-based dopamine. So I think this is there has been some follow-up work where people do seem to see movement-based dopamine signals that decrease through learning are smaller for things that animals do more often. So that would be fitting with our hypothesis, but I think like a thorough testing of that is still a bit like open.
Yeah, I've heard that the ventral striatum is more related to reward and dorsal striatum more related to movement. I didn't know that the tail of the striatum was also specifically related to movement in the absence of reward, or is reward also present in the tail of the striatum?
So we didn't find any reward signals in the tail of the striatum, and that's consistent with other work. The tail of the striatum is pretty small, so if you go even like a little bit more, so tail of the striatum is right at the back of the striatum, so like towards the back of your head. If you go even a little bit more forward, you actually start seeing reward signals pretty quickly. So the bit we were recording from is really where where sort of the auditory input is sort of thought to be really dense, and we don't find any reward signals. And other groups haven't found reward signals there. But I actually recorded from the ventral striatum as well in the task, and there you do see this really classic reward signal. And it was actually really cool to be able to contrast the signals we saw in the two areas. So you see this Q signal grow, consistent with this classic reinforcement learning reward prediction error model. So that ventral striatum really looks like everything you would expect from value-based dopamine learning.
And so what drives an action prediction error signal? Because the way I think is like, you're going to take an action, so what violates the expectation of whether or not you take an action? Yeah,
that's really interesting, and it's something I think is like really interesting to look at. So I think our task was not a good task to really look at the violations of the action prediction error. So in our task, you just basically start doing one thing and then you keep doing it. It'd be really cool to look at a task where there would be competing interests, like maybe cognitive processes that are like, oh, actually no, today I was meant to turn left here, not to right, or something where there's a block switching and you have to break a habit regularly. You don't allow the habit formation to fully form, for example, and then you could like sort of violate your habit. I think this could be really cool to look at, and I think that's for a slightly different task.
So it was more like the lack of action prediction error in your task that helped the mice learn.
Exactly. Well, yeah, the action prediction error helped them learn, and the lack of it was an indication that they had learned.
Right. Yeah. And so you also mentioned briefly that you transitioned from these experiments to computational modeling. Could you tell us a little bit about how you set out to model this system?
Yeah, actually this was helped a lot by lockdown. So obviously in lockdown we couldn't do experiments, and so I had to find something else to do. And we'd long talked about actually building some models of how computational models, because obviously this idea came from computational modeling. So building some computational models that recreated some of the effects we saw in our dopamine signals. So I set about, reading all the textbooks on how to do this, and also making a competing model with classic reward prediction error, using more like classic reinforcement learning models to capture the dopamine signal in our task.
So, were you able to recapitulate your results from classic reinforcement models?
No. So actually in the ventral striatum, the dopamine signal really looks like a classic reward prediction error. So if you make a sort of like relatively classic reward prediction error model of dopamine, you really see what happens in the ventral striatum. That's really it's really similar. So you see this reward signal decreasing, the Q signal should grow as the animals learn the task. If we make a model much more similar to these action prediction error models, where you're learning almost, I think the original models called it a habit formation model, so I think I can use that term. You are basically learning your habits, so saying like, okay, when I hear a high sound, I need to learn to predict. Instead of learning value, you're learning to predict how strong your association is between that sound and that action. And what you then do is you update it given the surprise you have at the action you actually take versus the action that you thought you were going to take. So are you violating that or not? And as we were talking about, in this task, it's very rare that you're going to end up violating it, but it's also to do with some elements of noise. So for example, if you say like, we don't have fully deterministic action choices based on value, that there is some uncertainty or some noise, we can also sometimes have trials where you would violate that. And actually the mice, once they really learned, they quickly actually become experts. So we didn't have a very long period to look at those violations, which would have been really cool. So I think a different task is a bit necessary, one where you'd explicitly create violations of the habit. I think that would be really cool if you want to look at that. But in the model, we can obviously look at that. So you can add noise terms and this sort of thing and see what happens on trials where it violates the behavior.
Right, yeah. And it's really nice. I like how your study is like very much based on like these classical theories, but also very novel and kind of supporting this new way of learning.
Thanks. Yeah, it's funny in a way. It's like very traditional, but in another way we add this like circuits element to it. So yeah, that's quite cool to like have bridged like psychology to like computational neuroscience to circuits neuroscience.
Yeah. In the task, where do you see, like at what time point do you see the action prediction error, or I guess action related information that you were able to extrapolate to say like this is habit formation? Like is it the cue, is it the onset of movement, is it the reward consumption, even though like decoupled from the actual value of the reward, like just looking at the movement of consuming a reward? Where in the task would you say you see the signal most strongly?
So the signal happens around the time of action initiation.
Okay.
I think one of the downsides about this task is, although we have a really well decoupled reward from movement, like the reward happens quite a long time after movement, cue is quite close in time to the movement, and this is to do with the nature of it being a freely paced. It's just a lot easier for mice to learn this kind of task if it's, I don't know, imagine having to like hold it in your head and wait for ages. It's really hard to train mice to do that, especially mice are super impulsive. So training waiting times is really, really hard.
Yeah.
So we chose to keep the task quite similar to the original task for ease of learning. But what we did do to control for it not being something to do with the cue and not happening at the time of the cue is that we did a version of the task where we played the cues sometimes when the mice were returning to the center port. So we tried to decouple the cue from the action and that association, and what we see is like if you sort of correlate out all the times they hear the cue, regardless of whether or not it is corresponding to the right action in the task or not, we still see that it's really coupled to just this action, and it's not really related to the cue. So if you sort of like you mess with that like in the normal version of the task, when they're experts, they always hear the same sound and always make the same choice. You have no ability to decorrelate that. But what we did is we messed with that, and we made the case that sometimes they would hear the same sound and make a different choice, and so you could look at the cue independently, as independently as possible.
But you would always have like a withhold period, so like the mice would need to like go to the start position first, and then the cue would play?
That's very short, but yes, there is always like a period where they have to initiate and then the cue plays.
And over time, over learning, do you see a decrease or an increase in this action prediction error signal?
So we see a decrease over learning, because consistent with the fact that this is the thing that's initially driving the bias, and then as they start to make the action that's always predicted from their behavior, they don't really need it anymore because it's fully predicted. This bias is also consistent with the optogenetic results we have. If you stimulate when making the contralateral choice, you can actually bias the behavior like in the whole session. So there's a general shift to having that bias, which is really cool.
And when you say you bias, do you bias to make them more accurate, to make them less accurate, to...
Yeah, so you bias to make them more accurate.
Okay. Could you do it both ways, or...?
Could you bias them to make them less accurate? Yeah, I think you could if you stimulated on error trials, you could bias them to make them... You'd have to do it in a time when they're not really learned the behavior. But yes, you could make them biased the other way.
Okay.
We chose to do the thing which is most like the naturalistic behavior.
Yeah.
I think just for ease of it being an easier thing to do.
Let's talk about your current work as a postdoc in Juan's lab and with Claudio Klopath. Could you tell us a little bit more about the research that you're doing in terms of modeling, and also specifically how it was transitioning from doing a lot of experimental work to computational work? Like, what was the learning curve? How did you self-teach? Was it something that you had guidance from?
Yeah, so I obviously switched to more computational work, and I got a bit of a taste for it with this work from my PhD. As I mentioned in lockdown, this was kind of the only thing I could do. And I really liked it, and I found it really cool how you could try out things that you can't do in animals, things that are impossible, basically, things like adding noise to things, or, this, like, actually probing at, hypothetically, if we could target this neuron or this neuron, like, what would happen? Mm-hmm. So that was really cool to me. I also really liked the speed. So computational work goes a lot faster, and it's cool to be able to try out lots of different things and have these real ideas of how something could work and try to come up with predictions for experimental results. So I moved in more computationally, but it's actually, my work is still quite related. So I work with Claudia Klopath, who's works very much deeply in computational neuroscience, and Juan Gallego, who's works a lot on BCIs and motor control and motor learning. So he's, I guess, the motor learning kind of person in my project, and Claudia's more the computational modeling person in my project. And I work on models of, so still very reinforcement learning based, but now I'm back to looking at the value-based system, and actually now looking at what happens, how do we learn when there's so many possible actions, and how does the brain take care of this? And I don't just mean actions, I mean we have a lot of muscle to control, we have a lot of joints to control. This is a super hard control problem, and it's not fully understood how the brain is actually dealing with the fact that we have so many bits of the body to control and coordinate and learn to control and coordinate. If you look at pro tennis player, the number of muscles they're using and having to learn to finally control to hit that ball is actually really high. And so it's actually a really hard problem.
Right. Now I get. I didn't quite understand earlier when you said action space, but
that makes a lot more sense. Yeah. No, I think So I think we think of it as what you might be doing is trying to decrease the dimensionality. Obviously that's a really high dimensional space. There's loads of muscles. If you control every single muscle individually, the dimensionality of that space, of that control space, is as big as the number of muscles. But we're looking at ways to reduce that dimensionality. So can we learn things about the structure of that action, of your actions, of your muscles, how they co-activate, this sort of thing. That means that we can actually learn in a smaller dimensionality, and not have to learn in that really high dimensional space of all of the muscles in your body.
Couldn't that apply to both the value-based and non-value-based learning?
It very much applies to both, and actually it's a big question that we've had about the action prediction error theory, is how do we deal with the fact that there are many actions, and what's one action versus another action. And actually for me this means we need a question of how do we represent actions in the brain? How does the neural representation know one action is different from another? And it needs to have some measure of that. Mm-hmm. And I think actually the same idea, that principle I'm working on, of basically trying to learn how actions are related to each other and learn over that how similar they are and different they are, is also going to be really useful for figuring out things like action prediction error, and understanding how different is this action from the action I took last time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's more fundamental, how do we process our own actions?
Yeah.
That applies to learning.
Yeah.
Going back to the modeling, how did it require you to learn a lot of maths? What kind of programs did you use?
Definitely, definitely more maths than I was used to. It was definitely a bit of a transition. Read a lot of Sutton and Bartow. If anyone doesn't know what that is, it's the reinforcement learning Bible. It's very good. But I self-taught a fair bit, but I honestly got a lot of help from both supervisors and postdocs in my lab. And I think if you have people who will help you out with learning skills and understand the advantages you have coming from the experimental background, that you know a lot of the literature, you know what's possible, and that there are some cool things you bring to the computational world from that, but that they're actually really going to help you along the learning process and not just sort of leave you. I think it's really, really, really important, and I was lucky enough to have some support in this, and so it wasn't all self-taught, very much sitting with people with code and being help, this isn't working, can you help me out? This has been really nice having that.
Yeah, how do you actually go about building a model? Do people tend to make it from scratch, or kind of modify things that already exist?
I think you can go both ways. It depends. It depends what you want to do. I've definitely kept to. So my current work is based off an idea that really came from like machine learning. So I think this is really nice if you're coming from an experimental background. Like I don't know if it would have been. I think it would have been a kind of crazy project to come in and really do something totally new in machine learning. You know, but like using a machine learning idea and applying it to neuroscience, I think is like a really nice space to work in if you're making that transition. So. I've really enjoyed that. So in many ways, I'm using an existing model. It didn't exist in code. It wasn't available. So that was a really intense part of the project, translating that to code. But that was also quite good for me to have to do that, yeah.
What do you mean translating it to code? Like, where did the model exist otherwise? Like, just as a theory?
Mathematically, yeah.
Okay.
No, so like if it's described mathematically but not in code, that translation I think was challenging for me coming from the experimental side of things, that I'd often seen things written mathematically, understood what that meant, but then really going to actually implementing yourself is that step you haven't really done before, if you come from an experimental background.
Yeah. I know, for example, like Neuron as a platform where you can like play around with like inhibition and excitation of different neuronal parts, and maybe like if you groups of neurons together. I imagine you don't use Neuron. Like, do you use Python? Like, what kind of platforms?
I understand. So my models that I've been working with in general haven't been working. They're not written at a sort of neural basis, so it's not like I model individual neurons. They're not biophysical models. I think that would be really cool if I wanted to like build a model at that level. So now I'm very much like using Python, PyTorch. My networks backpropagate. I'm sure some experimentalists will wag their fingers disapprovingly at me at this. But I think this was also for me part of the transition from experiments to computational work, was I realized I was really interested in work at this more conceptual level, at the in Mars levels of analysis, at the more algorithmic computational level of like what types of computations do we think are happening in the brain, not exactly how are they happening.
So I know, obviously, as you explained in your PhD work, like the models that you worked with there were experimentally based, right?
Yeah.
So currently, is this modeling also experimentally based, or is it just more like theory driven?
So the initial model sort of came to me when I read an experimental paper, and I sort of thought, actually, I think this could really be explained by a model that I think I was reading about in machine learning literature. So like that's kind of the dream, that you have that happen, that you see something that's you think it's got some experimental grounding, that you think you've read some paper that actually if you applied that to the brain, there's a way to make that happen. But I think there's still a lot of scope for like proving it. I think this is very much an idea, and I think this is obviously like one of the downsides of more computational work is that it's very much ideas, and it's the nicest thing is if you get what we got in the PhD, where we had really like experiments and theory in the same paper. And you're really working together with theorists, and you're really like taking the ideas from theory and trying to test them out. And I think that's obviously the dream, is having both and bringing them together.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, like, what do you miss about experimental work, but like, what are the advantages of computational work in your eyes?
I don't think I miss training mice.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it is cool collecting your own data.
Yeah.
I miss building setups. That's
really?
the fun. I miss the tinkering, which is also funny because when you're doing the experiments, I think you're always doing all that tinkering with the sort of stress of like, I need to like get on to actually doing the experiment. But I do miss those kind of days where you'd like be slowly tweaking something, or like just the physical, the job being very physical was quite fun.
Yeah.
So I missed that aspect a little bit. And sometimes I've been recently helping a little bit with building some setups, like very small role, but I really enjoyed it. But yeah, I missed that. The advantage of computational work, I really like how it's a lot more at the ideas level. So you can really think a lot about like how do we think the brain could work, and that's really creative. It's a really creative way to work. So I love that. I think the days can be a bit similar, because you're often, it's me at my computer most days. But yeah, I think there's also there's in both types of work, there's a lot of space for collaboration, I guess. I think with theory, because of the ideas level, I enjoy that type of collaboration a lot more, like talking to people about like, how could this work? Let's talk this out. I think experimentally collaboration often happens at the technique level. So like, oh, I know this technique, I'll show you, I'll teach you. So it's like a little bit different the way collaboration works with the two. I've honestly really enjoyed both. It's been cool to see both.
What would be some resources that you would recommend for someone that wants to transition from experimental to computational and that has zero knowledge of computational? So like, I don't know, textbooks, papers, that kind of thing.
No, I think this is really good. If you want reinforcement learning, obviously the Sutton Bartow textbook is the Bible, as I said, and we can link it. It's amazing. I think like it's the first place anyone's going to tell you to look. It's amazing. It's well written. It's clear. I really am a huge fan of Neuromatch. Even for people who aren't on the course, they have a lot of the lectures are available online. A lot of the course materials are available online. I briefly worked with RNNs and basically combined with learning from someone in my lab, I basically taught myself from Neuromatch how RNNs work and how to train an RNN, and I've supervised students on RNNs and I send them straight to Neuromatch. So I think Neuromatch makes amazing course materials, and it's like kind of unique to neuroscience, which I think is kind of cool that you have this huge online platform that's basically designed for neuroscientists who want to do more computational stuff. I think it's really aimed at exactly that type of person as well, who's like a bit more, maybe more experimentally minded, aimed at going more computational.
That's cool.
We'll link resources on the episode details and on our website.
Yeah. What are you looking for in terms of the future and like what you're going to do with your, I guess, current postdoctoral work, but also other side projects that you may have going on?
So we're currently writing up, so that's a fun process, one of my favorite parts of the process. So hopefully, watch this space for the theory work. And future-wise, I'm very much exploring, but I've sort of been thinking recently that actually one of my favorite bits about the job has often been to do with more like communications, more to do with outreach. So I'm also looking at like expanding that work, sharing science with people who are not just people with PhDs, people who come from really different backgrounds. So I've been doing a lot of side projects to do with outreach work, which has been something I really love and quite close to my heart. It's one of my favorite things, especially when the more complex the idea, the more I think it's super satisfying to find a way to communicate it to someone who may not have a science background or may not have a technical background.
It's really nice to get a perspective of someone who's actually like been fully immersed in experiments and experimental stuff and computational stuff, and now also communication stuff.
I'm trying to do everything apparently.
Well, I think that's the perfect place to end today's episode. Thank you so much, Francesca, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. You can find all the links to the resources we mentioned in the show notes and on our website. And feel free to follow us on our social media at neuroverse_pod. And the website is neuroversepod.com.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to check out our Twitter and Instagram at neuroverse_pod, and for more information, check out our website, neuroversepod.com. Thank you for all your support. We really appreciate it.